Welcome to Capital Dialogue. I'm Bob Priddy from the Missourinet and Missourinet.com, and we're glad to have you with us on our program today. One sure sign that the legislative session is coming to an end is the approval of the state budget. It has to be done a week before they adjourn, and the legislature made it with a day to spare this year. A big project because there's a ton of money involved, a lot of departments, a lot of agencies, a lot of issues, and today we're going to have four of the people who were involved in writing the state budget for the next fiscal year on our program. Let me start off by introducing you to the House Budget Chairman, Representative Ryan Silvey, who is from Kansas City. And next to him is Representative Sara Lampe, who is from Springfield, and she is the ranking Democrat on the House Budget Committee. Sitting next to me on my immediate right is State Senator Dan Brown, who is from R-Rolla, who's the Vice Chairman of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And next to him is the senior member of the Missouri Legislature, Senator Tim Green, who's the ranking Democrat on the Senate Appropriations Committee. Senator Green is wrapping up a 22-year career in the legislature this year, and he's not able to run again because of term limits, and we're going to miss having him on the program. We're going to miss having him in the Senate.
Thank you.
So, but enough of the platitudes about Senator Green. Let's talk dollars and cents. Budget bills begin in the House of Representatives. Representative Silvey, give me an idea. Although the legislative session started in January, you and your committee were at work on this budget well before the session started.
Sure. We start in the fall, actually, with the consensus revenue process and figuring out what the economic projections are going to be for the next year. And then over the interim, we also have a committee on budget transparency, which kind of goes into each department and looks at what they're doing in preparation for recommendations for the next year.
Now, the Budget Transparency is a fairly new committee. How has that helped the process?
I think it's been great. Speaker Tilley started it in my first year as budget chair, and it's given us the opportunity to really kind of look at things that maybe we don't have time to look into during the regular session. So it gets more members involved, and it gets them involved earlier, and I think it really aids the understanding of the legislature.
Representative Lampe is a Democrat from Springfield. Is there much of a philosophical divide when you start trying to figure out who's going to get money?
Certainly. But the reason the budget process works or does not work is the way in which the process works. We clearly have differences in ideology, but the way in which we go about coming to an agreement or coming to what we can live with or what we can trade is really about the process and the way it's done in a angry way or in a very nice way in which we know we have to come to some agreement in some places. And I want to compliment the chairman. In the House, the process worked without flair. It worked even though we didn't have a lot of money to work with. And we disagreed, and we would have votes of disagreement. It was not rancor.
Now, before I switch over to the Senate, you said you don't have a lot of money to work with. A lot of people would say $24 billion is not exactly pocket change.
But when you talk about the fact that 2/3 of the budget we can't touch, and only 1/3 of that budget is really up for grabs in terms of distribution among schools and among early childhood and veterans, we're talking about only 1/3 of that $24 billion budget.
Okay, we're going to get back to that a little bit later in the program. Once the House gets done passing its version of the Senate of the budget bill, it comes over to the Senate. Senator Brown, when you get that document, what do you guys look at? And do you decide you're going to rewrite the whole thing, or how do you handle this?
We have an appropriation staff, and we do a lot of prep work, as Representative Silvey indicated they do in the House. And so a lot of times we're in pretty close agreement, not always. When it depends on passing legislation, as it did this year, as for some of the bigger issues, tax amnesty and what we could book, that makes a difference on how we approach the budget. And so we have a staff that is looking at the general revenue and the consensus revenue estimates and trying to predict where we're going to be. As Representative Lamping brought out, there are some pass-through dollars we do not affect. We have a very small part of the budget that we actually deal with as far as making changes in how we spend this $24 billion budget.
Senator Green, you have been part of the budget process from your days in the House. You were a budget chairman over in the House of Representatives before you became a senator. Has this process gotten any easier?
I think the process is always difficult because there's always never enough money for everyone. So the process is similar in the way we work together. And in the House, just like in the Senate, we start in January. We have 6 weeks of testimony from the different bureaucracies and the public saying we need this or we need that. And then after the 6 weeks, we take about a 3 or 4 week break and then wait for the House to pass the budget bills, and then we act upon them over a 3 week period.
Do you remember what the budget was with the first budget you handled when you were in the House?
From 2000 to 2002, the budget was about $18 billion. So it's grown over the last 10 to 12 years, $6 billion. When I first came in 1988, it was about $9 billion.
Okay. So we're up roughly a third in the last 10 years or so. Where does that third come from, Representative Silvey?
You know, a lot of it is, as Senator Brown and Representative Lampe have talked about, is wrapped up in federal dollars. Federal dollars that flow through the state for various programs that have various requirements attached to them, whether it's a match on Medicaid or whether it's program-specific dollars. That's really where most of it comes from. I mean, of the $24 billion, we're at just under $8 billion is actually generated in what we call general revenue here in the state.
Money that's not earmarked in one way or another.
And then we have earmarked funds for conservation and for highways.
And those are things that the voters have earmarked, not something that
Correct.
members of the legislature earmark.
Constitutionally.
Yes.
So how hard is it then to take this 1/3 of the budget and spread that out among all these agencies that do not have specifically designated funding for?
It gets pretty dicey at times, and you know, we are constitutionally required to fund education at a 25% level of general revenue, and I think we're around 32% or 33. So we try to do a better job. That was one of the commitments made in the legislative body, both sides this year, was we're going to fund education more fully than the governor's rec even. And so you know that you've got to go with X amount of dollars to education, and the entire educational budget is made up of general revenue and federal funds and other funds, and so then you kind of have to go from there. Our part of some of the social programs, the federal government may put one in place and start funding it pretty maybe 90%, and then they start pulling back a little bit, and that puts quite a burden on state revenues at times.
I'd like to speak to education funding. We're $438 million underfunded on the current formula, on the foundation formula, and we didn't pass the formula fix bill this year, or at least we haven't so far, and that would help stabilize that a little bit. But if you look at the amount of money that we should be spending based on the formula from 2005, we're 438 underfunded, but we fully funded the amount that we had available this year.
There were some things that were recommended by the governor in January that be cut, and they weren't cut by this General Assembly by the time they wrote the final budget. We're going to come back in a couple of minutes, and we're going to talk about the things that they didn't cut, and we'll see you then.
I don't miss my car, and I feel safe when I ride this bus. A little over a year ago, I got my car demolished. So I gave up on driving, and I'm their best customer. I go everywhere on that bus 5 days a week. That's just part of my life now. I enjoy the camaraderie. The drivers are really good drivers, and they look after us. I just feel safe when I ride this bus.
To find out how rural public transportation can put more life in your day, just give us a call.
Mayday, mayday. I need help.
Vessel in distress. This is the United States Coast Guard.
There are many thankless jobs out there. This isn't one of them.
There are certain phrases in the legislative session that might not strike the public as being too glamorous or too interesting, and one of those is state budget. But within that state budget is every dollar that the state spends that affects people, like you and me and all the people at this table. And so we're really talking about people, and we're talking about the state's investment in people. Has the investment climate shifted in where the state puts money, Senator Green, in your 22 years?
Well, I think education's always the top priority, but one of the things people don't realize that we also spend a lot of money on with these general revenue dollars, which are your income tax and sales tax dollars from the citizens of the state, is corrections. Our population has risen. We're spending, when you put the judiciary in with the corrections budget, the same amount in those two budgets as we are in higher education. So I think one of the first ones that has been dealt, I guess you could say, a blow to funding is higher education. So you have in turn seen increased tuition cost on students and students becoming more in debt just to get their undergraduates. So there's always a cost when you take from one, somebody else has to suffer.
Well, let me switch over to Representative Silvey. The House decided it wasn't going to follow the governor's recommended, what was $106 million cut to higher education from last year's funding.
Correct.
Why did you make that decision?
You know, we looked at it, and as Senator Green said, I mean, one of the largest pots of general revenue is education, and of the education dollars, the easiest one to touch seems to be higher education. So in the time that Governor Nixon has been in office, each one of his budgets has recommended cuts to higher education. This year, if we would have gone along with it, it would have represented a 25% cut to higher education since he took office. And we just felt that we can't keep going there. I mean, as Senator Green said, you know, education is important to everybody. It costs more to incarcerate someone than to educate them, and we just felt that it was important that if we're going to pull out of this economic recession, it's going to take an educated workforce. And if we continue cutting the resources to build that educated workforce, it's just going to prolong the agony. So we decided in the House very early on that we were going to not stand by that, and we were going to fund higher education at last year's appropriated level.
Now, you're from Springfield, which has the second largest public university. What has the impact been on tuition and other expenses at the school that is in your district because of these continued budget cuts, and what would have been the impact this year?
Colleges and universities are operating right now on pre-1993 budget levels. So they're way behind. Even though we fully funded, they're still far behind. In most of our state colleges, Board of Governors decided to raise tuition because they didn't want to trust us to make sure that they received the money they needed. And it means that kids don't go to school, is what it means. That when you have tuition that is increased to a level that a student says, I can't afford to go. And if they don't have access to Pell Grants at a federal level, that creates another problem. But what it does, it keeps kids out of school. The other thing it does is hurt two-year colleges in terms of training workforce to be able to go right back into a job, to come out of a job, get retraining, and go right back in. Now, so it hurts all the way around.
You have the Missouri University of Science and Technology in R-Rolla. Has this whole business for the last 3 or 4 years had the same impact there?
It has had, and one thing I would like to point out, you know, we're mainly an engineering university, a professional school for all intent and purposes. I mean, there are other degree programs, but we still have about 32% of our students are the first time in their family to ever go to college. Mm-hmm. So tuition costs and tuition increase is a big factor on those individuals. And these kids are very bright. It's unbelievable, their abilities, and I sure don't want to limit their access to getting the training. And I wish we could do a better job in Missouri keeping our graduates here. You know, we're shipping a lot of our educated, most bright kids in the world to other states, and Missouri's got to do a better job keeping these guys here. They're just absolutely amazing in their abilities.
Senator Green, do you have some of the community colleges in the St. Louis Community College area in your district?
Yes, I have Florissant Valley Community College, and then I also am real close to the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Have they seen the same sort of a problem with them?
Well, yes, they've been hit with the crunch of numbers, but going on Representative Lampe's, the ones that can't afford it, that do go to college, end up with such a big debt that once they come out of college, that purchase of a first starter home or something like that, they're in debt for 20 years of their life that they have to prolong, so that affects the economy in a negative way as well because they're paying down on their student debt.
So has all of this just shifted the responsibilities and increased the debt for students?
Well, yeah, I think when I first came up in the late 80s, the students' tuition was about 35% of what it would cost, and the state was subsidizing about 65%. I think now the student pays about 65%. In the state, is their investment into public education for higher education is about 35%. So you've just shifted the cost.
Now, if you've decided not to cut higher education this year, where did you find that $106 million? Who lost?
You know, the governor laid out a pretty significant plan at the beginning of efficiencies within Medicaid. I think there was about $192 million in there. And then, you know, we just looked at efficiencies in other areas of the government. I mean, you've got 13 appropriations bills. So outside of education, you've got corrections. Corrections took a little bit of a hit. You know, Office of Administration, which is kind of what I consider the grinding gears of our bureaucracy. You know, there were some cuts made in there. So, but in order to make everything balanced, you're right. You have to take it from somebody.
Is that part of the reason we're $400 and some million light on
Certainly.
elementary, secondary?
And the other reason is because we won't pass bills like tax amnesty so that we can glean at least more revenue at that level.
Now, tax amnesty in the last minute or so that we have is a proposal that says people who haven't paid their taxes could pay them without getting any penalties from the state. Didn't fly over in your chamber. Why didn't it fly in the Senate?
We have some senators that believe very strongly that we should not reward bad behavior. They don't want to use one-time monies for ongoing budget problems. And, you know, I argue that if your home's in foreclosure, if your business is going under, you're going to grab whatever dollars that are available legally to pay that bill. And I think we have to have the discussion of tax credit reform going forward. We have ability to get more money in education in this budget if we do a couple of fixes, long term.
Senator Green?
Well, I concur. Probably one of the biggest things in the future they have to deal with is some type of tax credit reform, because tax credits in the state of Missouri have kind of become a entitlement. And people, when they think of tax credits, I always explain to them it's like having a coupon at the grocery store. When you pay your bill for your groceries, you have a tax credit. That's a coupon when it comes time to pay taxes. And that has been growing, and something needs to be done to do some reforms there, because that's kind of taking money off the top before you even do some of your programs. Another thing with this budget, where did we come up with the money, is we have a new assumption. And that assumption is we're expecting roughly $35 million increase in lottery proceeds coming to the General Assembly to give to education. So that's a large assumption as well. Lottery was $12 million above this year that they were in sales, and they expect $35 million next year. So we do assumptions all the time and one-time funding.
Okay, so go buy your tickets and buy a lot of them every week. We'll be back in a minute.
Has anyone ever said, you're the picture of health? You look healthy and you feel fine. But that may not be the full picture. Colorectal cancer is the #2 cancer killer. It doesn't always cause symptoms, but it can be prevented. Get screened. Make sure you are the picture of health.
To learn about screening in St. Louis, call 314-879-6392. That's 314-879-6392.
All across Missouri, people are making a difference. AmeriCorps, providing resources to meet human needs. Vista, building better communities. Learn and Serve, promoting the service of youth. Senior Corps, sharing wisdom and experience. Make a difference, be a volunteer. This message brought to you by the Missouri Community Service Commission. For more information, visit movolunteers.org or call 877-210-7611.
Every year, the Missouri state government forgoes collection of hundreds of millions of dollars in taxes because of tax credits. And Senator Green brought up this issue in our last segment. So let's turn to him right now and tell him and ask him about tax credit reform. When we talk about tax credits, this isn't something that I can usually get, is it?
No, what happened in the 90s is we were taking in more revenues under the Hancock provision. So instead of giving refunds, and we did give some refunds, we created these tax credit programs to entice renovation of historic buildings, for one. Well, everything has had to be downsized the last 5 or 6 years, but this entitlement has not. And it's a highly contentious issue. I think both the House and Senate had some ideas of how to bring it to some type of reform during special session. There were a few that wanted more done than what they thought, so it's basically a few senators says, if we don't get all of this, we're not going to negotiate, and we probably could have received some reforms and did not due to that thought process of how to deal legislatively.
How critical is it to the state budget that something be done about tax credits?
You know, I think it certainly does need to be addressed, but what people need to understand in this debate is it's not a fix-all. Because of the way tax credits are awarded and then redeemed, even if we said today, by fiat, we are not going to do any tax credits, they're done, we still wouldn't see the reciprocal effects of that for multiple years in the budget because so many have been awarded that have yet to been redeemed. So we still, even as we talk about tax credit reform, need to continue to address structural issues in the budget to help bring our spending under control. As we do that, I think it's a two-part process.
Now, tax credits are often discussed as ways to create jobs. Have they paid off that way?
Well, that's part of the debate as to whether they really do produce the jobs that we think they're going to produce. In some cases, I think they do. Some of them are social tax credits that aren't about producing jobs. They're about doing good in the state of Missouri. But we passed more tax credit bills again this year that were based on the fact that they would in fact produce jobs. I'll tell you, one of the best places we could put money that isn't a tax credit is in our tourism industry, because it turns money right around at $57 for every dollar spent by a tourist in Missouri. Something we're overlooking, and it certainly could help offset our budget.
Let me explore that a little bit with you, because I don't know how many bills I've covered through the years that call for spending money on X project. And the idea is, well, for every dollar we spend here, we get back $3 or $10 or whatever.
Isn't that the Remy model we're all angry about?
Does that really work?
The Remy model?
Yeah.
There's been instances where the Remy model was very, very accurate in its predictions, and there's been instances that it was very, very inaccurate in prediction. And you have to realize that, you know, we're putting in as accurate a data as we can, but it's very difficult to measure expected economic success. And so whether the Remy model is the right model to use or not, I think that the data going in really says a lot about what you're going to get out. And it is merely a prediction. And unfortunately, sometimes they're totally wrong. And sometimes they come out and much greater economic activities created than what is predicted by the Remy model, which is a group in economic development that predicts what a project is going to do.
Senator Green, do they really produce jobs?
I think we don't need to rehash and restudy the issue. The governor, in his first year during the interim, created a bipartisan independent group outside of the legislature, even though there were some legislators on it, to come up with what tax credit programs do work, which ones do not work, which ones should be streamlined. That proposal's been sitting out there for 2 years. So it's not reinventing the wheel. The study has been done, which ones work, which ones do not work, which ones need to be reformed. And as Representative Silvey said, even though if you do bring these reforms, there's about a 5 or 6 year period before those reforms are really enacted to bring revenues into the budget.
Representative Silvey, it's been years and years and years ago. I remember a governor in his State of the State speech talked about Medicaid being the program that eats the state budget. And it certainly hasn't quit chomping since he talked about it all those many years ago. How do we control Medicaid?
You know, it's really going to be an important summer when we look at what's going to happen to Medicaid, because as the Supreme Court considers the Affordable Care Act, one thing that everybody focuses on the individual mandate, but in that bill is also a mandatory increase in Medicaid eligibility that would add about 400,000 people to Medicaid in the state of Missouri. If that is allowed to stand, it will take a bigger bite than we've seen at one time to date, and I'm not sure how we handle it. I know some states are exploring ways to try and convince the federal government, instead of giving us all these matching funds with strings, just give us a Medicaid block grant and let us decide how to handle the health care in our own state. I think that's an intriguing possibility. If they would go for that, I think we would probably have a better idea of how to provide health care in our state than they do in Washington. But until something major like that shifts, it will continue to eat and eat and eat away at the state budget.
Are there people?
But we could also start talking about how to keep people off Medicaid rolls.
That was going to be my question. Are there people who don't belong there?
Well, I'm not going to go there. Should they not be there? What I'm going to say is people qualify for Medicaid eligibility because they have low income. We need to pass the minimum wage initiative that's out there right now to make sure people have more money to be able to get out of that point at which they qualify. We're not having that discussion, and we're not talking about how do we create then those opportunities for people in Missouri instead of keeping them in poverty where they have to have more Medicaid assistance.
Senator Brown, is that the answer to the Medicaid issue?
I think that we have to look historically. The Medicaid issue seems to grow about 13% a year. And if the Affordable Care Act goes into effect and you put, I think it's 300% of poverty goes on, the minimum wage increase, what it does to small business is eliminates jobs for high school kids, part-timers, this kind of thing. So I don't absolutely agree with Representative Lampe. That discussion will continue, but Medicaid's a federal program that's funded by the state, and I agree with Representative Silvey. Unless we are issued block grants and allow us to manage that program on the state level, there's no way we can reach this funding that would be required by the federal government.
Senator Green, we have about a minute or so left. How would you solve this problem?
Well, first thing we need to do is start rewarding businesses that do provide health care to their employees. We've done that with a few of the proposals dealing with tax credits, but these developers that are receiving the tax credits, the jobs they produce should have health care. There's the old saying, you're going to pay no matter what. So those of us that have health insurance are going to pay for those that do not have health insurance because people are required to get the care if they go into an emergency room. So the uninsured or the indigent care is going to be paid either by the taxpayer or by the insured who's paying $8 for that Band-Aid instead of a quarter. So we need to figure out accessibility to health care, and we need to quit attacking the federal idea of how to deal with health care and start engaging in affordable health care.
The legislature spends 6 months and more working on the state budget, and we've tried to talk in these 30 minutes about just a few of the things that they've been working on all this time. The budget's very complicated, but it affects all of us, and these are the people who've helped draw up the one for the next fiscal year. We thank them for being on the show with us. We'll see you again next month.